In the spirit of Halloween, paranormal or not, what is the scariest, creepiest, or most unsettling experience of your life? Growing up, my bedroom was the only one that faced the front of the house and street. When I was about 8 or 9, I woke up to my dad calmly, but firmly telling me to get up, go in the bathroom, and shut the door. I was annoyed, because I was half asleep, but I listened. Apparently, I was more tired than I realized, because I fell asleep on the bathroom floor. The next morning, I asked my mom what happened. She seemed oblivious and confused. I looked at my dad like she was crazy, and I asked him why he had woken me up. He denied doing it. I was becoming frustrated to the point of tears, but I ultimately let it go. Fast forward to college. I was home one break, and I decided to ask again. I had thought of that night off and on for years, and it still bothered me. This time, my dad goes, "Ha. I was wondering if you even remembered that." Turns out, that a lot of houses on our block were being vandalized and robbed all those years ago. Someone had broken into the garage, and was inside the house. My room was partially over the garage. My dad heard it happen, and quietly got me to safety. Police were called, the guy ran. He was never caught, however, and my parents didn't want a terrified kid on their hands, so, for years, they pretended like nothing had ever happened. It wasn't supernatural, but it was unsettling for sure. When I was a kid, I woke up in the middle of the night, to my bed shaking. Normally that would scare the crap out of me, but instead, I was just kind of annoyed. I rolled over, and muttered, "Stop it." The shaking stopped immediately. Then a male voice speaks right beside me, saying, "Sorry." That's when I freaked out. I'm pretty sure, my childhood house was haunted. When I was 16 in the mid-90s, aka the I know everything, I'm invincible, and you can't stop me age, I got in a fight with an acquaintance, while a whole bunch of us were hanging out at his house. Stupid fight, can't remember what about, but I decided, F it, I was going home. I lived about 5 miles away, but I didn't have a car, and since it was 2 a.m., there were no buses. I was going to walk home. In the middle of the night, though not as safe as it seemed neighborhood, as a tiny 16-year-old girl. So I did. I think, in hindsight, my friends either didn't believe I was going to do it, or were too startled by the sudden argument to realize what I was doing. I left the house, and started hoofing it. About a mile out, the suburban housing neighborhood melted into a main street, with highway access. I started to notice a grayish minivan following me. It would follow me, pass me, turn a corner, and about 3 blocks later, it would do the same thing. I mean, really obvious what it was doing. I crossed over to the other side of the street, so I was walking the opposite of traffic flow, and thus, no car could come up behind me. It kept doing it, on the other side of the street. About a mile later, there was a 24-hour Fred Meyer, West Coast USA chain grocery and all-purpose store, lights bright, but parking lot empty-ish. I immediately crossed the parking lot, and went to head inside. Just before I got to the doors, the minivan that had been following me, pulled up into one of the parking spots. A guy called out from the driver's side, and said, "I don't want you to walk over here, just stay there and listen. I just wanted to let you know what I was doing. I saw you walking a while back, but I also saw a dark car that was following you. A couple of times you went to turn around, or stopped, so, it started following you down a parallel side street. When I saw it, I started to follow you both, just to make sure you were safe. Go inside the store, and call someone to come pick you up, please. I haven't seen the car since you headed across the lot." He waited until I was inside the store, and then pulled away. I didn't have anyone to call, so, I just let the night cashier know what was going on, and hung out with her for about an hour and a half. Then I finished the walk home. I've never forgotten the incident, or that man, whoever he was. During the walk, I never saw the dark car he mentioned, but I've always been convinced, he saved my life that night. Not to me, but to my sister. Her husband and her, had just had their first child, a few months prior. My brother-in-law was working the graveyard shift at his job, as my sister stayed home taking care of my nephew. Around 2 a.m., she heard loud knocking on her back door. She went to go check it out, and saw a lady banging on the door, asking for my sister to let her in. The lady told my sister, that her husband had just beat her down the street, and was looking for her. My sister was hesitant to let her in, since she had a newborn in the house, and didn't want to interfere. She told the lady, that the best she could do was call the police for her. The lady told my sister, to not call the police, and to let her in. This is where my sister got suspicious. She went to get her phone and called 911. When she went back to the door, the lady was gone. The police arrived a few minutes later, and they told my sister that the same situation happened a few streets down. Apparently, the couple would do this act to get into people's homes. I'm sure this is very common, but having it almost happen to my sister and my nephew just creeps me out. Some real Clockwork Orange shit. Yeah, that is a pretty common tactic. When I was in my early 20s, I lived in Virginia with my wife, while we were both in the Navy. We lived in an apartment in Virginia Beach. One night at about 1 a.m., there was someone banging loudly on our door. The door was on the first floor of the apartment, and there were interior stairs that lead up to the second floor, where the rest of the apartment was laid out. Because of this setup, there was an intercom system from the top of the stairs to the front door. After hearing the banging, and telling my wife to stay in bed with her phone ready to call 911, I grabbed a knife, and went to the intercom. I asked what they wanted so late, and a man, though I could tell there were at least two of them, responded that they were taking donations for Hurricane Katrina victims. This was only shortly after the hurricane happened, but doing it at 1 a.m. didn't make sense, so, of course, my first response that I wasn't an idiot, was armed, and would now be calling the police. The guy got mad, and called me a few bad names before banging on my door a couple more times. I checked the perimeter and that was it. The wife had called 911, and they said it was a scam. They were running in the area for the same reason. There's a lot of shitty people out there. I was home alone once, when my parents were out of town. We had just moved into our house, so there was an empty lot next to our house, with the house half built. My parents were the types to leave the outdoor side garage door unlocked. Dumbasses, I know. Well, while they were gone, I was watching TV, and all of a sudden, the door that leads into my garage from the inside starts to wiggle. I put my TV on mute, and I listen again. I see it actually move that time. I start freaking out, and I'm kind of in shock, looking for the phone, can't find the house phone, so I search for my cell. Remembered I left my charger in my parents' car, so I'm frantically looking for the house phone. Our house was so new, my mom hadn't even put blinds or drapes up in the kitchen or living room. Well, whoever was wiggling my garage door knob starts banging on the windows in my living room. Again, no blinds or phone, and at that moment, I realize this guy is seeing my every move, so I shoot upstairs. Again looking frantically for the phone, and also trying to figure out how and where I'd jump out of my house to get away from the maniac that's outside my house, if I needed to. He then starts pounding on my front door. I can tell at that point, he's using something metal, or plastic, by the sound of the thumbs. I really thought he was going to shoot my door open. I remember at that moment, I was pissed at myself for being a dumbass teenager that frequently talked on the phone, because I always just left it lying around, never putting it back on the base. I wanted so badly to push the button that detects where my house phone is, but I thought, if he heard where it was, he'd break the window nearest to it and take it. I then remembered, I left the phone in my mom's room, and as I passed the hallway to her room, I see two people pacing in front of my house. I'm freaking out, trying to find my dad's gun in my parents' bedroom. I find the phone, and call 911. As I'm on the phone, the window breaks. I'm upstairs, and I'm scared to death. Suddenly everything goes silent. I'm waiting in my parents' pitch-black closet, for what seems like an eternity, then I hear the sirens. Cops show up, but there is no one to be found. I figured that they hadn't gone too far, since it had just occurred. Cops never found my tormentors. On the plus side, the company building the house next door, same company that built ours, hired overnight security to stay on our street, until the house was built, which was definitely refreshing. Edit, wow, I did not think this story would blow up. It was definitely a scary experience. I was 17 at the time. I did suffer from night terrors for about a month, then recovered. DR, two guys try to break into my house, while I'm home alone. Torment me for what seems to be eternity, call cops, don't catch the perpetrators, gain overnight security. Because of experience. On a way to a camping trip, I passed by an old, painted-up car, with decorations of Muppets and stuff on it. Obviously owned by a crazy person, who couldn't drive over 50 miles per hour. Without stopping, we passed the same car, 40 minutes later. Ah, yes, country folk. We're good at this. Let me explain. My sister lives in a small town, let's call it Point A, and must drive 2 hours, through 2 mountain passes, on a single-lane highway to my town. Point B. If she continues through my town on the same road, she must drive 45 minutes, until the road dead ends, to reach my mother's house. Point C. So, it takes my sister 2 hours 45 minutes, to get to mom's house, on the only available road. Except we don't take the road. We take unmarked backroads, abandoned logging roads, and can get from point A to point C, in 45 minutes. One night, about 10 months ago, there was a pretty heavy snowstorm in my area. All of the roads were closed, and a curfew was issued for everybody, except emergency medical personnel. I had been shoveling snow for most of the day, and was dead tired come nightfall. Didn't have the energy to do much of anything, besides eat dinner, and lay down. I fire up some OG Star Trek, and begin to doze off. A couple of hours later, around 1 a.m., I hear the sound of a door rattling, and a slight whisper saying my name, Vladimir Ponin. I sit up a bit and realize it's coming from my parents' room, becoming fainter with the passing time. After 10 minutes or so, I gather up the courage to see what the hell is going on. Shitty folding knife in hand, I peek out into the hallway, and don't see anything. The noise is still coming from the room next door, the rattling becoming more rushed as I approach. Cautiously, I open the door, and sneak inside. It's pitch black, and I can't see anything. My eyes are taking entirely too long to adjust to the darkness. I'm shuffling forward, and all of a sudden, something grabs and pulls on my leg. At this point, I was so freaked out, I jumped back. As the whispers continued, I recognized my dad's voice. He was asking me for help. He had a stroke, while walking to use the bathroom, around 1 a.m. that night. After he fell, he was able to use his left foot to rattle the door to his bathroom. My mom fell asleep on the couch in the living room, and wasn't around to help, or hear. I was able to grab the house phone, and call 911, and despite the weather, the police and an ambulance arrived within 10 minutes. That was the scariest night of my life. The doctors told us, there wasn't much hope for my dad before going into surgery, since he had a hemorrhagic stroke, and there was a massive amount of bleeding. Fast forward 10 months, and my old man is cognitively the same, just paralyzed on his right side. He had every infection under the sun while in the hospital, but he staved them off, and is still with us today. He was my best friend before the incident, and my hero after. Dr. Heard some rattling and whispers, freaked out, found my dad lying on the ground, after a massive stroke. I've had multiple times, when I've woken up in the middle of the night, and was sure I could see a figure in my room, until I turned on my bedside light. Usually this scares me a bit, but my most memorable one was, waking up, thinking, I saw some short figure at the end of my bloody bed, and saying, "F off, I'm trying to sleep." Then returning to burying my face into the comfort of my pillow. Seems like it worked. On my previous job, when our building was still under construction, the only floors that were occupied, were the 1st, 2nd, 5th, 6th and 7th. One time, I was alone inside the elevator, going from 1st to the 6th floor, when suddenly it stopped, and opened on the 3rd floor. Normally I would just disregard it, but rumors were all over, that a ghost child, was playing around on the vacant floors. So, I pressed the closed button, as fast as I could. When it closed, I heard noises, like someone was tapping their fingers, on the walls of the elevator. Walking towards a pack of howling wild dogs, on the other side of a bush line, going to get rid of them, to protect cattle, several hundred meters away, they got our scent on the wind. Those howls turned to growls, and snarls. 10-year-old me, booked it back home. That moment you realize, they know you and where you are, was creepy. To clear something up for everyone asking, I was with my dad and 17-year-old brother. They were both armed. When we got in growling range and heard them, I freaked, looked at Dad, and said, "I'm going home," and legged it downhill toward my house. Dad said later, he didn't even think my legs touched the ground, I was going that fast. I remember coming to a barbed wire fence, and not even slowing down, just dove into an army roll under it, and kept going. Dad and my brother continued on. When they go around the corner of the trees and in sight, one adult, and 4 half-grown pups, charged them. Brother froze. Dad saw that the alpha was still sitting and growling, so, he had a quick pot shot. Just missed, but it was enough to scare them off. When I was around 16, my rapidly growing family finally moved from the house I had spent my entire life in. As you would expect, we spent a lot of time fondly remembering things we used to do in the house, as we were packing everything up. At some point, I decided to go into the downstairs closet with a flashlight, and read. Something I used to do, when I was younger, to get some peace and quiet. Now, this is one of those deep closets, that goes under the stairs. It went back around 8 feet, and then had a left turn, into a very low maybe 3-foot high space. This space was largely occupied, by a mountain of old blankets, and stuffed animals. Of course, this is the most fluffy spot to sit and read. About an hour in, I shift a little, to get comfortable, and I hear, "Hello," slow, warped, hoarse voice, say, "You always make me happy." I flipped my shit, hit my head on the low ceiling, and practically broke the door down getting out. After hyperventilating, and explaining to my family, why there was no color left on my face, I went back to see what it was. It was my stuffed little bear, from when I was 3 or 4 years old, that I happened to lean on, just tried to press his belly. When I pressed his stomach again, though, nothing. This poor bear I hadn't played with, since I was a toddler, used the last of its power, used its dying breath, to tell me, I made it happy. You make me happy, too, little bear. When you're not making me, piss myself. TLDR, suddenly dead grandfather watching my back, making sure I'm safe. Back when my grandfather died, his children and some of the grandchildren took turns in staying over at grandma's house. We'd spend the night and help her out around the house, while also having some time alone in the house we all love, and spending some final moments with grandpa, his embalmed body in the living room, where his big old desk used to be. The house was on a pretty big plot of land with a nice big barn, and while grandma loved her gardening, grandpa used to take care of the lawn. One day, he had felt a bit wheezy while mowing the lawn, so he went inside, and eventually ended up calling the doctor and going to the hospital. He unceremoniously died 3 weeks later, unwilling to fight the cancer that had formed in his gut over the past few years. As one of the older grandkids, I stayed over one night as well. Bluntly speaking, I was a bit on edge with just having a dead body in the house, but nothing really eventful happened that night. Said good night to my grandfather, felt weird, and went upstairs to rest. The next morning, my grandmother was already preparing dinner for all the people that would be coming by to pay their respects. She, quite sternly, told me she wanted to do this particular thing alone, so I decided to start the day by mowing the stretch of lawn my grandfather never got to finish. I knew how big he and grandmother have always been on having the garden in top shape whenever there were people over, and I didn't want to let him down. It wasn't a small patch of grass, but I figured the electric push mower should be more than enough. I hooked it up using a long, orange extension cord, and got to work. Now, you have to know, my grandfather was a skilled, but super safe, handyman. He was an electrical engineer by trade, and always working on the house, or tinkering in the barn, doing the bigger gardening projects my grandmother couldn't do, making us toys or fixing our bikes, etc. We always got to help him out, but he always kept an eye on us with whatever we were doing, making sure we were using the tools in the correct way, weren't running around with screwdrivers in our pockets, teaching us how to work with the electric mower, and how to handle the long extension cord, to not run over it with the mower. When I was mowing the lawn, I was thinking about all of that, instead of actually minding the extension cord. I effed up. I ran over a coil of it, slightly damaging the cable down to the copper, but not cutting it in half completely. The safest way to proceed would be to unplug the cord, roll it back up and get another, not damaged one. What I did puzzles me to this day. I was nearing completion anyway, and decided to continue a bit longer, now carefully avoiding the cord. After finishing up, I went to roll up the cord around my arm, as I always did, as my grandfather taught me. I was thinking about him, how hard this was on grandma, and I stopped minding where I grabbed the cord. I grabbed straight into the exposed copper. I felt a short, sharp jolt in the palm of my hand, and immediately realized what happened. I tried to let go, but my hand and arm cramped up. At the time, naively, I thought I was gonna die, and I thought how stupid I had been, and how this would impact my already grieving family. It must have only been a split second, but it felt like I had stood there for 10 minutes. Suddenly, the reflexes in my arm kicked in, and I threw the cable to the floor. I took a moment to breathe and stood there, dazed out of my mind, listening to the wind in the trees, and trying to figure out what had happened. I made my way into the barn to unplug the cord from the wall. It wasn't plugged in. I figured I must have yanked it out of the wall with my not-so-ninja reflexes, but quickly realized the angle for me to be able to do that were all wrong, and besides, there was a ton of slack in the cable. I checked in and around the barn, but there was no one on the property. I could see my grandmother through the kitchen window, still working on preparing meals for the tens of people that would come around later. The dog was still in his own enclosed section of the garden, on the other side of the house, ears pointed, tail in the air, eyes fixated on me in the barn, behind me, nervously whimpering and pacing back and forth. I had never believed in something of a spirit world, an afterlife, souls, or energy, staying behind in the physical world, any of that. But as silly as it sounds, on that day I did. On that day, I was convinced my grandfather was watching my back, to make sure I wasn't doing anything stupid. Alright, so, it turned out to be quite long, and I'm sure this will be buried, as opposed to my grandfather, wrapped in cloth, and cremated on nothing but wood board, his choosing, but it felt good to write this out. This is not paranormal, but was immensely creepy at the time. I was visiting my hometown, and decided to pick up my old high school friend from his house, and take him to dinner and a drink, to catch up. He is kinda stressed, and tells me that his ex, with whom he had broken up with, over 2 years prior, has been stalking him and harassing him. I drive him home afterwards, and it starts to drizzle. As I drop him off at his house, the neighborhood was dark and quiet by now. We both notice a bag, tied to my side view mirror. It was likely attached, when we were at the restaurant. We open it to see a poorly taken photo of a tree, taken at night, with flash. There was a brief letter, obviously written from his ex, that said, "I buried our first love letter under this tree, years ago. This tree is growing from our love." I made sure my friend got into his house all right, and got the heck out of there. We rented a house that never felt like home. You always felt creeped out walking in there, like you were being watched. My boyfriend and our roommate both worked nights, so I would be there by myself, a lot. One night I was doing my usual stuff, and watching some TV before bed. I had this overwhelming feeling, all night, that I should avoid the hallway, and not look directly down it. It was creepy. The feeling of being watched and terrified lasted for about 2 hours, before I decided to suck it up, and make my way to my room. I left the hallway lights on, and went to bed. Just as I turned to the side table light, I heard a drawer being pulled out, and hitting the stopper. I turned on the light, and nothing was out of place. This went on about 6 times, before I decided I was sleeping with the light on. I curled up under the covers, and waited for the boyfriend to get home. He comes rolling in, about 3 a.m. He's laughing at me, for being such a pussy, gets into bed, and turned the light off, and that's when all hell broke loose. All the doors down the hallway slammed shut, one by one, then our closet doors started rattling. The sound coming from inside could only be described as total destruction. It sounded like the shelves, the pole, and everything in there was being tossed around. The boyfriend joined me under the covers, and we were both terrified. After it stopped, it took 5 to 10 minutes to convince him to go check around the house. Nothing was out of place, and our roommate had drove 3 hours back home that night to be with his family, so we knew it wasn't him. We slept with the light on the rest of the night, and moved out soon after. I still can't drive by that house without being creeped out. Although nobody believes me, I know what I saw. And it wasn't a stealth bomber. I was about 14, and at about 10:30, I was in bed, trying to fall asleep on a school night. I started to hear a hum that quickly began growing in intensity as whatever was making it got closer. So, I bent the blinds on the window behind me and peered out. Something bright was steadily approaching, and it was flying very low. As it got closer, I began to see more detail. In the middle was a bright white sphere. It had long shafts coming out radially from this central sphere. At the end of each of these shafts, maybe 10 to 15 in total, was a smaller sphere, each illuminated with a different color, noticeably dimmer than the central sphere. It zoomed right overhead, couldn't have been more than 20 feet over my house. I ran downstairs, and told my parents. They told me to go back to bed. Next day, I told my friends and teachers. They laughed at me. They suggested it was probably a stealth bomber, because there's an AFB nearby, and stealth bomber sightings aren't rare. This thing was the opposite of stealthy. So, I have no idea what it was, but I'll never forget the night I saw the psychedelic sombrero. My family told me this. I had fever very often when I was young. The medicines didn't help. One day, a stranger on the street asked my mom if I was always sick, and who was the elderly following me. My mom was confused, as there was no elderly nearby. The stranger pointed into the air, and described my dead paternal grandmother's look, the hairstyle, and clothes she wore to her grave. My dad was from a different town, and my mom would have known it, if the stranger was a mutual friend. The stranger instructed my dad to call my grandmother, to go back. My mysterious fever stopped. My parents, hiring muscle to hurt me and my wife. Slashing the tires on my car, sending me texts, with photos of me taken from hiding. I had to go underground, leave my job, move to somewhere they don't know. They're still looking. The police doesn't believe they would hurt their son. I don't even order food using my real name. I don't know when, or how, they're going to find me, but I'm trying to leave the whole country. How's that for a real-life scare? I had a phone interview last week, and I'm still terrified. It could be a private detective out, hunting me. 3 of my relatives died. And I found out by chance, including my grandfather, who died, thinking I was dead. They even had a funeral for me. This is the story of how a creepy encounter with a scary man at a harbor cafe saved me from something even more terrifying. It was in the autumn of 1994, and I was 19 years old. At the time, my dad had been working for almost 6 months abroad, and I was planning a surprise visit. My dad and I have always been close. I am an only child, and my mother died of cancer when I was still a baby. So, it was just my dad and I, really, a tiny little family, but he made up for it by being the most awesome parent ever. Now that I wasn't a little kid anymore, I appreciated that more and more. I had booked the ticket and was ready to go. It was gonna be great fun to surprise him with a visit. I had to take the ferry though, and I had just gotten my driving license, and felt really unhappy about having to drive my little car on board the ferry, and decided to not bring a car at all, and just rent one. Once I got there, having time to spend, I decided to have coffee at a nearby cafe, since I was early, and they hadn't started letting people onto the ferry just yet. At the cafe there were lots of truck drivers, and I soon realized I was the only woman there. One man, a 40-ish bloke with ice blue eyes and tattoos all over, was eyeing me from across the room. Something about him made my skin crawl. I got up to leave, feeling suddenly very uncomfortable, and to my utter horror, he followed. What do I do now? I asked myself. This was before everyone owned a cell phone, I might add. I decided to try and look busy, and maybe he would leave me alone. So, I pulled out my ticket, and tried to look like I was reading it carefully, when he suddenly snatched it from my hand, and said, "I'm on the same boat. I'll have hours of your company then, how lovely," in a voice that was an absurd combination of jovial flattery and hidden hostility. I felt it very strongly, that if I got on that boat, with this man who now knew my booking details, I'd be in grave danger. I can't explain why the feeling was so overwhelming, but it was. And I decided there and then to not get on the boat. The ticket had been cheap anyway, I could get on the next one instead. I hid in the ladies' room, until I knew the ferry had left, and then I went to rebook my ticket. The story could have ended here, a creepy encounter with a stalkerish man, but it isn't. I was right in the assumption that getting on that ferry would have been unbelievably dangerous. Have you figured it out yet? The date was September 28, 1994, the name of the ship was MS Estonia, and that cold night, she sank in the Baltic Sea, taking 852 people with her, resulting in the worst ferry catastrophe to strike Sweden to this day. I still recall that day with horror, and wonder what would have happened if this creepy man had not taken an interest in me. If I had not listened to my instinct and gotten on board, instead of waiting for the next boat. Would I have been among the survivors? Or would my dad have seen my name on the list of lives lost in the Baltic Sea? Back when I worked night shift as a security guard, I would experience mild hallucinations due to my poor sleep schedule. I was doing my patrol, and I was feeling particularly out of it, so I kept getting those flashes of movement in the corner of my eye, but I was convinced it was just my brain effing up. At the site I was working, there is a large warehouse filled with chemical waste that has only one light on in it. As I'm going along, I see a pale shape on the ground, and quickly recognize it as a body. My adrenaline spikes, and I nearly pass out. Upon closer inspection, it turned out to be a CPR dummy, the workers left out for training. Edit, since it seems to be a point of interest, I figure I'll clarify. Pass out is probably not the best description of my reaction. It was more like, my mind blanked, and it took a second for me to regain my senses. I was truly scared that I just found a dead body, as I am not an armed guard, and was over a mile away from any assistance. Definitely, it was more my imagination overworking what was actually a simple situation. I was sitting in our office room home alone when I was 19. I was typing a paper for one of my college classes. The office room used to be my sister's room before she moved out, so a lot of her decorations are still there. She had a photo of a mountain range, an oval-shaped mirror, and 3 different hangings that read, "Faith, Hope, and Love." This makes 5 total things hanging on the wall in the room. Suddenly, I got random chills. Which happens all the time. It was pretty cold. But this time, as soon as I got the chills, everything in the room hanging on the walls fell off simultaneously. This really freaked me out, but it got a tiny bit worse. I got up and walked out of the room, only to notice everything hanging on a wall in my house had fell, besides the television in my room. All the pictures in the living room and other rooms, all the trophies in my room from Little League sports, and even a stand that held candles. I wasn't sure what to do. I picked up all the stuff and hung it back up, which actually took me around 15 to 20 minutes. Then I drove to campus to finish my paper. Never told my parents. It's also worth mentioning, this happened around noon, on a sunny day, 3 winters ago. 15 years old. I had just got home from work, so I went to my bedroom to change out of my work clothes and get ready for bed. I'm in the middle of undressing when I look to my bedroom window to catch my reflection. And I see a man's face. I dropped to the floor and turned off the lights, scrambling to get dressed, still watching the window. The face is gone, but I'm still watching. Then, a effing camera. No face, just a camera pointed at me sitting on the floor. I bolt from my room and tell my mom and brother. My brother went outside, and our ladder from the backyard was lying there. But nobody around. Couldn't sleep for a year after that, just stared at that window. Haven't thought about that in years. Thanks Reddit. Cop here. I've posted this story before, so it may sound familiar. I was dispatched to a house at about 1 a.m. for a prowler. We get there and talk to the residents. Long story short, they saw 2 people wearing masks, one Jason-style hockey mask, don't remember the other, in the yard across the street. It was like 2 weeks past Halloween, so it seemed believable. We check the area and don't see anything. 10 to 8. It's worth noting, the residents didn't seem drunk or high or crazy at all. A few times you'll get a similar call and get there to find the resident is strung out on meth and seeing things. However, back to the story. An hour later, we get called back. This time we have our dispatcher on the phone with them, while we are surrounding the area. We, about 5 of us, are in a perfect position. Dispatch tells us, they can still see the prowlers in the next yard. We start to move in. Dispatch says, the residents saw the 2 prowlers wave, and move into the shed. Guess where I am? That's right, next to the shed. I give verbal commands, bang on the door, and nothing. F it, fine. I'll come in after you. Doors open, and empty. I even think to check for a trapdoor. Nothing. It is raised about 4 inches, so there isn't even a possibility of a door leading out. Again check the area, and find nothing. I talked to the residents. They said, as I was moving in on the shed, the 2 put their finger to their lips, giving the shush sign, and then they both waved. They moved into the shed as I was next to it. We went over every possibility, trying to come up with an explanation. If the caller was just effing with us, they had no prior history of it, as in repeated calls for service at the address. I'm not much of a believer in paranormal stuff, but I can still appreciate a situation where I cannot logically explain what just happened. This one is not too scary, but my aunt and uncle moved into a 19th century home in a small town in Maine a few years back. Think something from Stephen King. Their neighbors warned them about previous paranormal incidents. Since they moved in, many more incidents have taken place. These incidents include, but are not limited to, an in-your-face chocolate smell in the kitchen when no one had been cooking, random items appearing in places they shouldn't be. My aunt was a school administrator, now retired, and she has a filing cabinet full of old documents in the basement. One night, while I was visiting, a binder from that filing cabinet was underneath my bed when I woke up. The filing cabinet was in the very back of their storage space, and would have required someone to scramble over camping equipment, old furniture, etc., to get to it. Weird. Levitating objects. Super skeptical of this one. My aunt was home alone, running on a treadmill in her basement. Unexplained banging noises came from the ground floor. She yells, "For heaven's sake, shut the F up already," and the banging subsides. The most memorable incident for me was when my uncle noticed that his medication went missing. My aunt yelled to the ghost that his medication is important, and is the one thing that is not to be played with. They later found his pill bottles standing upright, underneath the bed. Standing upright. They couldn't have rolled underneath. Never happened again. The ghost has not really done anything harmful, and from what I have heard, can even be described as playful. We have affectionately dubbed the ghost, Gracie the Ghost. A few years ago, my family moved to New Hampshire. First off, let me explain that the basement had a door that you could open in the backyard, and that the door was made out of plywood. If someone wanted to break in, they could have. Well, myself, my 3 sisters, and my brother were in the living room one night, basement door in the living room. My brother is trying to scare everyone, and starts saying he can hear things coming from the basement. Finally he gets up, and opens the door to the basement. We see someone's shadow, and hear someone running, at full speed, down the basement stairs. We scream bloody murder. Stepdad comes down with butcher knives, ready to kill. He's in the basement, and no one is there. The door is still intact outside, and ever since then, the dog wouldn't go into the living room, never would go into the basement, either. I was 16. So, a few weeks after that, I left to live with other family members. Nope. I worked at a movie theater, selling concessions, and this older man approaches the counter and orders. I asked him, "Would you like anything else?" And he looks at me, and says, "Every time I ask for the thing I want, they keep telling me it's illegal." I'm quite creeped out by this guy, and so I just sort of chuckle. He then proceeds to ask me, "Do you want to know what I ask?" Working in concessions, part of the job is making the moviegoers feel welcome, so I say, "Sure," and then what he says to me was the most disturbing thing I have ever heard. He says, "You wouldn't have any young girls in the back over there, locked up for me?" He said, as he's pointing to the closet. He then continued, "Because that's all I really want, a young girl. I mean, I wish I could just bring them back here, and you'd keep them there locked up, so I could just pick them up whenever I wanted. I like younger girls, you know?" At this point, a line had already started forming up behind him, and he had still not paid yet, so I told him the total of his order. He then asked me, "You understand, right?" And I didn't know what to say, so I just chuckled and agreed. Then he pulled out a $10 bill, said, "I like you," put it into the tip jar, and walked away. Edit. So, it has now occurred to me, the word agree was the wrong wording. By agree I meant, I uncomfortably said, "Sure," because he had asked me, and I was just so in shock that I had no idea what else to, so I attempted to end the conversation as fast as possible. My 8-year-old self was sitting in the dining room, drawing at the kitchen table. I hear what sounded exactly like my mother say, "Hello" to me. "Hello, Ryan." I turned to my left, expecting to see my mother. Instead, a full-body shadow person is standing there, about 10 feet away from me, standing in my kitchen. I sat in shock looking at it for about 10 seconds. It then turned to its left and walked into the wall. I stand up and walk also to my right, into my living room, where my brother is doing homework. "What's wrong?" "I saw a ghost." "Is that what called your name?" It is very notable, I never told my brother, it said my name. To give some backstory to who this shadow person may have been, my grandmother died about 6 to 8 months before, from lung cancer. She had the same voice as my mother. As well as, she cared for me when I was a baby. I never knew her well. In her terminal stages of her life, I went and saw her with my family. She looked incredibly bad. The only remembrance of my grandmother is when she was dying. The one thing I have found truly odd about the experience is how much power it would have taken to manifest yourself and speak. And out of any message to tell me using that much power, you say, "Hello" to me? It's just so weird. Not as scary as others, but creeped me out, nonetheless. I was out of town on business, and my security camera went off in the middle of the night. Now, I'm half asleep, in a hotel, hundreds of miles away from home, and I don't believe in ghosts, so my first thought was that someone was shining a flashlight in the house to case it. Not knowing what else to do, and not wanting to call the police and look foolish, I used the two-way sound on the camera to yell, "Get the F away from the house, I'm calling the police." The moving light didn't seem to react to that, So, I just sat there, in my hotel room, watching it until it stopped. The next night it happened again. And the next. Now I've shown the footage to my colleagues, and they are convinced I have a ghost. I've asked the pet sitter to look around the house for footprints in the snow, and nothing. I finally get home, and nothing is out of place, but now I realize that I have to sleep in this house with the weird moving light. So, when the sun went down, I was desperately trying to figure out what it was. 2 days later, I did. This is kind of hard to explain, but bear with me. This was a very bad winter, and I had taken the internet's advice, and thrown pantyhose, filled with rock salt, up into my gutters, to prevent ice dams. The string hanging down from one of them had an ice crystal on it, and that little ice crystal was blowing in the breeze, and reflecting the driveway lights back into the house. So, absolutely not creepy at all, but when you're away from home, and see a floating orb in your house, it will give one the willies, for sure. A few years ago, I partook in a group meditation session. For one of the activities, we had to partner up. One of us sat in a chair, while the other stood behind, and used their hands to guide energy around various parts of the body. I don't know much about it, but a little Reiki-ish, I guess. Not long into my session on the chair, I noticed a strange pain in my lower back. It wasn't a physical pain, though. It's hard to describe it, but it was more of an internal pain, right at the base of my spine, as if my mind was making it up as part of the meditation process. Over 5 minutes or so, it gradually got worse, to the point where it became throbbingly uncomfortable. In my mind, I said something like, "I need this pain to stop now." And it did. The rest of the session went by, without a hitch. Afterwards, we discussed our experiences. As I told my story about my lower back pain, the woman who had been using her hands on me, became visibly emotional, and started to cry. I thought it was a strange reaction, but didn't look too deeply into it. A few weeks later, the organizer of the meditation group emailed me to let me know the woman who assisted me at the session had passed away overnight. She'd been battling cancer of the lower spine for years, and it got the better of her. I've never felt so creeped out, like I did that day, when it clicked, that I may have somehow been channeling her pain. This would probably be scary to some people, but I found it hilarious. I had stories of the building we were in that had, issues, where multiple people saw and heard things, but I like this incident better. For about a month during my 3rd year of college, I was seeing a lot of people that weren't there, never got it checked out. I suspect I might have been having mini seizures, and among the few incidences was this weird situation where, for a week, I decided to not wear pants while sleeping. I've always worn pajama pants or shorts, but a girlfriend mentioned how awesome it is to sleep in just panties, so I decided to try. I'm Chinese, so my parents are very proper, and would never be okay with me not wearing pants in the house, but I thought it would be okay if I locked my door when I was going to sleep, so they didn't come in. Every night for that week, I would wake up in the middle of the night to a guy sitting on the couch in my room, directly facing me, and looking at me. Weirdest thing was that this guy was blonde, late teens, and Caucasian, wearing a white t-shirt and jeans. Above average handsome, like 7/10, but nothing to die for. I mean, I'm Chinese, right? My closest friends are Asian, why would I be seeing a white dude of all things? Anyway, my first response was not, "Oh my god, there's an intruder in my room." It was, "Oh my god, there's a guy in my room. And I'm not wearing any pants." I'd get up and walk to where he was sitting, because my clean laundry is usually folded on the couch he was sitting on. All the while, he's just staring at me, and I'd grab a pair of pants, pull it on, and climb back into bed. And go back to sleep. This consistently happened for the week that I experimented with wearing no pants. Always the same guy, always the same place on the couch, always the same reaction from me, where the only thing that bothered me was that he was male, and he was seeing me without pants on. Yes, I'd wake up with pants in the morning. When I told my mom, predictably, she said, "Didn't I always tell you that you should sleep with pants on? What if there was a fire? You'd run outside with no pants on." I guess the possibility that it could be an actual person who broke into my room in the middle of the night to watch me sleep wasn't as important as not having pants on. Anyway, for that month, lots of other things like this happened, different people, but always turned out to be not there. Never happened again after. When I was 13, I experienced the ghost of my grandmother. She died in her sleep while taking a nap on the living room couch. Afterwards, According to my father and grandfather, every now and then, they could hear her make the trip from the bedroom to the kitchen, and open the refrigerator door. A trip she made many times when she was alive. At first, I thought, my father and grandfather were making this up, having fun at my expense. A couple years after she passed away, my father and I went to spend the weekend with my grandfather. My father and I slept on the living room couch. It opened into a double bed. The same couch my grandmother died on. My grandfather left the house to go to a next-door neighbor's house to play poker. My father and I went to bed in the living room. My father went right to sleep. I laid awake, reading a magazine. After a while, I heard the noise of the back bedroom door being pulled open. I heard the sound of shuffling feet. I heard the creak in the floor directly in front of the bathroom doorway. I heard more shuffling feet. Then I heard the fridge door being pulled open, and I heard the sound of glass bottles in the fridge door clinking against each other. Back then, they were still putting soft drinks in glass bottles. Feeling thirsty, I decide to get out of bed and go join my grandfather in the kitchen for a cold drink. I go into the kitchen, only to find myself all alone. I was puzzled. I could have sworn I heard my grandfather walk from the bedroom into the kitchen and open the fridge. Then I remembered that my grandfather wasn't home. He was over the neighbor's house, and he hadn't come back yet. Then I remembered my grandfather's and father's ghost stories. Then I got scared. I raced from the kitchen into the living room and leapt over my sleeping father into my side of the bed. Then I went to sleep. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up with a feeling of paralyzing fear in my body. I was frozen. I was lying on my right side. It took a while for me to work up the courage to turn my head to the left. My head was covered by my blanket. There was a shadow being cast onto my blanket. The shadow was the outline of a head and shoulders of a woman with a beehive hairdo. My grandmother used to always have a beehive hairdo, even years after it went out of style, up until she died. I heard heavy breathing coming from the shadow. I had to work up the courage to move one of my hands to remove the blanket off of my face. When I did, in an instant, the paralyzing fear I felt was gone. The shadow was gone. The sound of heavy breathing was gone. My father was still sleeping. I pulled the blanket back over my head and went back to sleep. Only to wake up again on my right side. The paralyzing fear was back. Forcing myself to turn my head. The shadow was back. The heavy breathing was back. Again, I had to summon up all my courage to move my hand to take my blanket off my face, only to find nothing there and the paralyzing fear gone. I went through this same routine the entire night. I lost count of how many times this happened through the night. Maybe a dozen. Maybe more. But it happened a lot. The next morning, I told my father what happened to me throughout the entire night while he slept. The sounds of the bedroom door opening. The shuffling feet. The fridge door opening. Nobody in the kitchen. Being awakened with a paralyzing fear. The shadow. The heavy breathing. The repeat performances throughout the night. I kind of expected him to tell me that I was just seeing and hearing things. But instead, he smiled and exclaimed, "That was Grandma." It happened last night. I picked up a nasty cold last week, visiting Boston. I've been all coughy and phlegmy and mucousy and gross. Sleeping is obviously difficult. My spouse says that I coughed for hours, though I had been soundly asleep, so I'm sleeping in the other room. Last night, I woke up in the middle of the night, completely unable to breathe. Not like my nose is stuffed up, breathing is difficult, but I'm literally choking, and zero is moving through my body, and my brain is beginning to starve for oxygen. My guess is, I rolled onto my back, and my respiratory system got blocked with mucus or something. I stood up, and still couldn't breathe. I ran to the main bedroom and dropped onto all fours, and still, not a single molecule of air was moving into, or out of my body. I'm there for what felt like an eternity, like I'm underwater, or someone is strangling me, completely incapable of taking a single breath. Finally, after probably 45 seconds, the phlegm, or whatever, moves just a little bit and I'm able to draw in a tiny amount of air, and begin coughing. I was in full-on tears, and thought I was going to die right there. All I could think about was my dear childhood friend, who passed away last year, in his sleep, in what seemed like a simple flu, at the age of only 37, and that I was about to follow him from a stupid cold. I can't imagine what would have happened if I had been 60, or 80, or whatever, and had that experience, or maybe even just unhealthy from lifestyle, or some other disease. I might not have been able to write this post this morning. Not so much scary, but kind of crazy, and something I cannot explain, or understand. In high school, I had a friend, we'll call him John, for these purposes. Me and John played football together, and we would always get extra lifting sessions at the high school gym. We remained friends after high school, and even worked together for a bit. He ended up getting into selling pills, and our relationship deteriorated, to the point we were no longer speaking. Fast forward a few years later, and I have this dream. In my dream, I am back at my high school gym lifting weights with John. We were just chatting about random stuff, having a good time, and then he suddenly says that he has to go. I tell him I don't want him to leave, because I want to keep hanging out, and I missed him. He just says he's really sorry, but has to leave. I say, okay, see you later, and he replies with a nod, and see ya. I woke up to the sound of my phone ringing. I see it is my mom, and answer it. She tells me that John had died last night, and asking if I am okay, and other mom stuff. She had heard from John's mom, who called in, saying that John's siblings would not be at school the rest of the week, because of his death. My mom was a secretary at the school they went to. I can't help but think that something paranormal had happened to allow me to make peace with, and say goodbye to my friend, and have some bit of closure. He was 25 when he died of an overdose, and was the first person, really close to me, who had died. Literally my second comment on Reddit, ever. Driving on a super isolated road, late at night in Buff, New Mexico, 285 north, for those who know. For those who don't, it's a skinny little 2-lane road for the most part, which goes right through the middle of a lot of nothing, with roughly 100 miles of FGL on either side of it, and got followed for a long ways by a huge black pickup truck. One of those giant Dodge King Ranch things, all black, cow catcher on the front, limo black on all the windows, everything. It tailgated me at 85 miles per hour, for about 75 miles, and when I stopped at a truck stop to pee, it pulled off too, but nobody got out. It just idled away in the parking lot, until I got back in, and got on the highway again. E-Fare followed me all the way to Carlsbad, before peeling off, and heading back south. I've never seen it again, but I refuse to make that drive by myself, anymore. My friend died in a car accident, and they towed the car pretty early in the day. We were teens, so we thought we should go collect all her things that were ejected from the car, when she hit the tree. After about a half hour, I was overwhelmed, and just sat down, and started crying. I had my two friends with me cleaning stuff up, and they just let me get it out for a bit. Someone started rubbing my shoulders in the deepest massage I have ever had, and it was really helping me get control of myself and relaxing me. I let them rub for a few minutes, and then I put my hand on theirs, to let them know I was appreciative. There was no hand, just my shoulder. I turned around to say thank you to whoever it was, and there was nobody. I looked up at the car, and my two friends were standing there talking about something. Something had been touching me. I ran to the car, and asked my friends if it was them. They looked at me like I was crazy. I made everyone get in the car super fast and we left. I think a spirit was comforting me in my loss, and I am grateful and freaked out for it. I can still remember how it felt, and it's been 22 years. When I was a teen, I worked at a cable access studio, and made many movies. My neighbors gave me their father's old video camera. They told me he never used it, but it didn't seem to work anymore, and had a tape jammed in it. I fixed it up, and on the tape was hours of him driving around at night, and filming people through their windows. Nothing overly sexual was on it, but there is something unsettling about seeing peeping Tom footage of a guy eating dinner with his family, or over 20 minutes of some girls dancing around in their room. The time I was being stalked and harassed by a bunch of teen thugs in a car. I was about 12 or 13 years old. One time, I'm walking to my psychiatrist for my weekly appointment. It's a half-hour walk, and after dark. I enjoyed walking, especially after dark, when things were quiet, peaceful, and slow, and no one else around. No, I didn't live in a dangerous neighborhood, nor did my walk take me through any dangerous neighborhoods. As I'm about halfway to my destination, a car, a Cadillac, comes driving down the street. Some people, both male and female, in the car, are sticking themselves halfway out the windows, and are taunting me, and jeering me, as they drive by. A bunch of people in their late teens, or early 20s. I ignore them, and keep on walking. About a minute or two later, the same car comes down the street again. and those people are jeering me and taunting me again. I don't know who they are. Maybe they live in the neighborhood. I still ignore them and keep walking. Another minute or so goes by, and again, they come driving down the street, taunting and jeering me. Now I'm worried. They're circling the block over and over, deliberately focusing on me. As soon as they reach the corner, and make their turn, and are out of sight, I duck behind some bushes in someone's front yard, and wait. The car comes again down the street. This time, not seeing me walking down the street, they're not jeering. They pass right by me in my hiding place, and turn the corner. I think they think I've finally reached my destination, one of the houses on the block, and went inside, and as a result, drove away. I thought wrong. Stupidly, I leave my hiding place, and go back to walking on my way to my psychiatrist. I should have stayed there behind those bushes much longer, because I hear the car approaching. They spot me, and start taunting and jeering me again. They turn the corner. This time, I run towards my destination, but I know I won't get far, before the car and those kids catch up with me again. So, to that effect, I decided to hide again behind the bushes in front of an apartment building. This time resolving to stay there for good, until the thugs in the car gives up their searching for me. I'm hiding there behind the bushes for not long. Maybe about 30 seconds or so, when the guy whose apartment it is, pops out from his apartment, asking what I'm doing hiding in his bushes. At first he probably thinks I'm a burglar or something, but I explained to him how I'm walking to my psychiatrist, and how I'm being followed and harassed by a bunch of kids in a car, which was why I'm hiding in his bushes. The guy can instantly tell from the tone of my voice, and my facial expressions, that I'm telling him the truth. He can see how scared I am. Just then the car comes down the street, and pulls right up at the curb, directly in front of us. They look at me, and the guy I'm with. Not a mean-looking guy, in his late 30s early 40s, but tough and serious looking enough. He's not wearing a shirt. But he's wearing a sleeveless undershirt, which reveals that this guy's upper body is very well toned, slightly muscular, and no fat. I'm looking at the car, and I realize that it's missing a few people inside. The car doesn't look so full now. The guy I'm with just gives them a mean stare. He asks me, "You know them?" I explain that no, I don't know them at all. I haven't the slightest idea of who they are. Just then, as the car is sitting there, about 3 of them approach, walking from the other direction. The car was traveling east to west. Those 3 were walking on foot from west to east. So, that's why the car seemed not so full. They were looking to escalate the situation. They weren't satisfied with just driving by and taunting me. They changed tactics. A few of them got out of the car up ahead, and started walking towards me, while the ones in the car took another turn around the block. Their plan now was to physically trap me in between themselves and their car. Perhaps grab me and drag me into the car with them, for whatever reasons. But seeing my tough guy guardian angel with me, the kids walking towards the car, instead got into the car, and took off. The guy offered to stay with me for a little longer if I wanted to duck into his apartment, to stay there, until I was sure that it was safe to continue on my journey. I had a feeling that this was the last I was going to see of those guys in their car, and I didn't want to be late for my appointment. So, I thanked the guy for his offer, but declined, and decided to head on my way. The guy went back into his apartment, and closed the door. I looked at the closed door, and hoped that I didn't make a mistake by turning down the guy's offer of better safety, because I was still scared. Thankfully, I was right about not seeing the car again. The rest of my walk I was unmolested. I reached my psychiatrist's office. I told my therapist about what happened. He insisted on calling the police. The police came, and took a report from me. That's the last I heard of it. On my way back home, I usually took the same route that I came from, up the same streets. But this evening, I varied my way home, taking some different side streets to walk on. Never saw that car, or those thugs, again. One day, my friend and I decided to go camping at a hot spring that was closed due to a recent fire. We arrived there, and set up our tent. It was about 8 p.m. We stripped completely naked, and went up to the hot spring. I brought a machete, and a bag of goldfish. We had to climb up to it, and the only way going down was going back the slippery way we came. We hung there for about 2.5 hours, when a flashlight came on from above our heads. There was someone right above us. Keep in mind, it's 10:30, at a closed-down site, when it's pitch black. So, we are in the worst possible position, wet, naked, cold, alone, dark, and all we have is a machete, and a bag of goldfish. Well, this person walks around the area for about 45 minutes, with a flashlight, before it suddenly stops. My friend and I still decide to stay there for a bit, and now it is 1. Then we run out when it's 30 degrees, so we're shivering cold. We get our pants and unlaced shoes on. He packs up our tent, while I walk around with a machete on watch. Then we begin to run through the black burnt forest, and since we were so scared, we thought that everything was something. I thought the wind was a distant laugh, or a branch was a face. But eventually, we made it back to the car, after an hour of traversing the forest. A week later, on the news, a dead body was found in the river nearby.